Hello, everybody. It is great to see you in the webinar. In the third panel of our conference. Today we are going to deal with a very important question. Well, something that is so prevalent in Africa, and that is the focus of many governments and competition authorities on the promotion of SMEs. And for that discussion, we are very, very thankful and grateful to have so many experts around us. And I'd like to welcome Ms. Betty Maina. She's a director at Genesis Analytics, the East Africa in Kenya. And she's a former cabinet secretary in Kenya's Ministry of Industrialisation, Trade and Enterprise Development. Ms. Betty's full bio is available on the website, and what I've said just now doesn't do justice to Ms. Betty's significant experience also in government. We also welcome Florence Abebe from the Nigerian Competition and Consumer Protection Commission, and she's the head of the Anti-Competitive Practices Department. And she's also a member of the Competition Consultative Committee of the ECOWAS Regional Competition Authority. Welcome, Florence. Then I'm also welcoming Zamageda Zungu. She's the founding director of Izithelo Group, and she's a PhD candidate focusing on organisational resilience. And I'm also welcoming Mr. Gregory Mofokeng. Welcome, Gregory. Gregory is the Vice President of the Black Business Council, and is also in the Exco of the Construction Sector Charter Council, Deputy Chair of the Construction Alliance SA, and a representative on NEDLAC and BRICS Business Council. He's chair of many companies. It is a great pleasure to have you all involved in this very important discussion. I'm going to start with a short intro just to explain the rationale for having a panel that deals with the issue of small business policies. In Africa, you would find that competition authorities in particular implement SME policies, and that's normally pursuant to mergers that might pose a particular problem. For example, SME remedies may typically entail forced procurement from an SME for a particular period of time, the transfer of large amounts of funds to support SMEs, particularly those owned by historically disadvantaged people, and the purpose of those funds is to support supplier and enterprise development. And then merging parties must also implement programs providing training, mentorship, or capacity building support to SMEs. So this is normally the types of policies that are being implemented, or remedies that are being implemented by competition authorities. Now, purely economically speaking, and of course there are many dimensions, but just economically speaking, the consequences of these types of conditions are that SMEs may be to a very small degree exposed to the true market forces. And the consequences of that type of protection may be the implosion of SMEs whenever all of that support is removed. And then also, from a day-to-day perspective, very little exposure to the daily challenges that may cultivate entrepreneurial skills. And those are often very important to become business fit, if I can call it, if I can describe it in that way. So those are the consequences for the small business, but there are also consequences for the merged entity. That includes things like, for example, increased costs, whether it's operational or direct or indirect, but then also reduced flexibility and efficiency, because there's such a large piece of costs that it must now incur just in order to continue operating in the supply chain. And then there's also consequences for the supply chain as a whole, because the supply chain incurs a higher cost structure, and there's less room for maneuvering for all firms should there be any kind of a supply shock or other market shock. And depending on the number of SME suppliers, to whom the forced sourcing applies, that could also lead to market power. In fact, there has been complaints in South Africa that due to these forced procurement systems or remedies, some of these SMEs can readily inflate their prices because they become monopolies. Now, with the above in mind, let's consider the example of the steel industry. The South African government implemented several policies to promote domestic beneficiation and job creation and industrial growth, and also SMEs. Now, these policies appeared to have played a significant role in the deterioration of ArcelorMittal South Africa, which is South Africa's largest steel producer. It is on the brink of closing its Newcastle plant. It has recently received funding from the Industrial Development Corporation, the IDC, and the role of that funding is to try to extend the plant's life with another 6 months, but you can hear it's not a long time. So, of course, AMSA also faced certain external challenges, but some of the most significant challenges that it faced is regarding the sale of scrap, because that must be done at a discount of 30 to 40% to the mini mills, and the mini mills are the SMEs basically that has been incentivized to open their doors as receivers of scrap, and then they use a particular technology to supply scrap to certain downstream markets. And then also, if AMSA wishes to export scrap, it must pay a 20% export tax. And that is discouraging for AMSA. So that basically ensures that there is a steady and affordable supply of scrap for the minimals. And in addition to the preferential payment subsidy, some mills have also received substantial government support. The IDC has invested approximately 14 billion South African rand, which is basically just below, let's say, about $1 billion in debt or equity in the mini mills. And these significant cost advantages enjoyed by the mini mills have negatively affected several aspects of the supply chain, which include, of course, AMSA, but also downstream industries like construction and automotive and infrastructure, because they rely on AMSA for good quality steel. And although some of the mini mills can produce some specialty steels, if the quality is normally too low to help some of these downstream industries. Some of these downstream industries, for example, automotive, have very ambitious localization plans, and they are now reconsidering those. The other areas of the supply chain that's influenced also include scrap generators, subsistence collectors, and of course consumers. Now, the interesting thing is these mini mills, especially the new ones, the ones that basically are basically established in order to make use of the subsidy, they are often praised as highly profitable and a policy success story, but they face very little market forces while the rest of the supply chain around them are imploding. And that is the let's call it a worst case scenario, but that is the example that I'd like to start with to show that we can have SME policies that can show to a large degree disregard for the importance of a complete supply chain and the importance of keeping that together. And that may unfortunately lead to the jeopardizing of that market. And then also the SMEs, because the SMEs are also intrinsically part of that market. So with this in mind, let's look at the features of SME policies that our panelists come across in all of their endeavours. And I'm going to start with Ms. Betty from Genesis in Kenya. Ms. Betty, what are some of those typical features of SMEs that you have come across with based on your exposure not only to Kenya but the EAC and the United Nations?
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Odie, and thank you for the invitation to join in this very important meeting.
Yes.
Thank you for the background that you have given and the dilemma of the steel sector
Yes.
in South Africa. And I suspect that every country has such an unfortunate outcome of policy, because we are always, countries are always pursuing very diverse and no, they're pursuing a common vision, but the experience of subsectors will always be different. So having said that, one, I think we just need to confirm and acknowledge that SMEs are a significant part
Yeah.
of the private sector.
Correct.
In Africa, more than they represent more than 90% of all private sector businesses. And the last count I saw is there are more than 120 million small and medium enterprises. So that's a significant number of entrepreneurs, a significant number of households, and a significant voice in the politics of our countries. In terms of policies, many countries pursue similar policies, and they go into different pockets. A typical claim is that SMEs don't have access to finance.
Correct.
So a lot of public policy is a response to that question, and many instruments are put in place, whether it is setting up some banks, dedicated banks to support SMEs, whether it is giving credit guarantee schemes to these banks to support SMEs, or even education. So there's a pocket of initiatives around money and making money available for small businesses. Another pocket of interventions is around creation of spaces where SMEs can conduct their businesses. So the whole conversation about industrial parks,
Yeah.
whether they're special economic zones or cluster zones, but that's, provision of serviced industrial sites that can be utilized by small businesses. And that's often accompanied by an attempt to cluster businesses, whether they're in agriculture, whether they're in industry, whether they're in steel, whether they're in automotive sector. You will find a lot of our countries have these industrial parks. So you provide money, you provide space. And the third pocket of work is often around the regulatory environment, enabling business environment, regulatory reforms, taxation regimes, that entire business facilitation. That's one of the other pockets. And a fourth one, so my colleagues can also contribute, is often around building up the capacity of entrepreneurs. Both building up the capacity of potential employees, and that's where a lot of our TVETs and vocational education institutions come into the ecosystem, but also continuous skill development for entrepreneurs, provision of business development services, provision of entrepreneurship education, digital literacy. There is a lot of work around capacity development for entrepreneurs. And then a fifth one is then around provisions of markets, both internal markets and external markets. In your example for the steel sector, you talked about, preferential contracts, and that is a policy that many countries use, local procurement, to ensure that small and medium enterprises have some ready market within the country. But at the same time, a lot of our international development, international trade agreements or regional trade agreements are an attempt to create markets for businesses. So let me just leave it at those 5 pockets of work, but there is a lot more that countries do
Yes.
to try and promote small businesses.
Thank you very much, Ms. Betty. Gregory, can you provide us with your views based on everything that you have seen to date in relation to the typical features of SME policies?
Good afternoon to you, audience, to the colleagues, and I also want to send out my gratitude for the invitation that you've sent us. In fact, and I'm hoping that we will go back to the example of Arcelor, because I have very strong views around what is happening with Arcelor and the genesis of the problems that we are talking about today.
Okay.
But more pointed to your question, I think within the South African landscape, we don't have a well-cultivated ecosystem to support SMEs. I think we've got patchy policies here and there.
Yeah.
Some of them you've already mentioned earlier, such as enterprise and supplier development programs. These are, of course, subsectors of the broader, broad-based Black economic empowerment legislation. And if one then looks at the enterprise and supplier development pillar of that act and the codes, it essentially addresses three broad issues, which is funding to SMEs, access to markets, as well as non-financial support, which one can term capacity building.
Yeah.
But it has to be understood that this is within the context of corporates trying to transform, themselves in order to comply with the legislation of the country. We also do have, funding policies that are there. We all know that in the country we do have, development financial institutions that are owned by government. Two in particular, which are relevant to small businesses, is the South African, the Small Enterprise Development Finance Agency, SEDFA, which is an amalgamation of the old SEDA and SIFA, as well as the National Empowerment Fund. Those are the institutions that were set up deliberately by government to fund SMEs. Of course, we are not happy with the efficacy of those institutions. We just believe that there's a lot of red tape around them, and as a consequence, SMEs are not getting access to finance to the extent that we all hoped they will. The other feature of our policy environment is actually the vacancy of government procurement opportunities for SMEs. The policy is there. However, if you look at in reality, you'll find that government as the main culprit does not even meet its annual targets on supporting SMEs, let alone women-owned, youth, and people living with disabilities. Generally, they don't meet their targets when it comes to making those ring-fenced opportunities available to SMEs. Lastly, we have seen, of course, some measures being put in place to try and relax some of the compliance requirements for SMEs. I can mention one piece of legislation, which is the Employment Equity Act. If you employ, people that are less than 50, you don't have to comply with that piece of legislation. So there's been some, level of interference by government to say, how do we reduce the, the compliance burden on small businesses? Lastly, there was also a committee put together by the presidency to try and reduce red tape. And it was led by Mr. Sipho Nkosi, the former CEO of one of our largest coal mining businesses in the country, Exco. And we are yet to see the outcome, of that intervention and what the committee is recommending to try and reduce, red tape, especially as it relates to SMEs. So let me just pause there to say this is what we're experiencing from the SME, perspective. Very patchy, and we really don't have an ecosystem that is well cultivated for SMEs to thrive, unfortunately.
Yes, thank you very much, Gregory, for that background. Zama, can you give us an indication of the features of the incubation programs in the construction or the steel sector, and what exactly is the type of assistance in those particular programs that are provided?
Thank you so much, Odie, for your questions, and thank you very much for having me. A warm
Yeah.
welcome to all our audiences as well as my co-panelists.
Mhm.
I must agree here with both my co-panelists who've spoken before me about you know, the policies around SMEs in the African or South African context.
Mm.
And the incubation programs that we currently have are also very much aligned with, what these policies try to set out in terms of assisting SMEs. Now, what we're seeing in the South African context is that most of these are responding to the issue of finance, which was mentioned, the issue of spaces, in terms of providing office space, the issue of capacity building. So we
Mm.
do have those built into the programs we currently have. However, the issue of what I'm seeing is we're seeing more and more incubation programs come up. I mean, if you look at around the year 2000, we were sitting with around five, and because of these policies, we've seen an increase in number of
Mm.
these incubation programs. However, my view on that is increasing the number alone without actually course correcting what these incubation programs are meant to do does not necessarily yield the results that we're
Yeah.
actually looking for from these programs.
Yes.
If you look at what research says, and I'm going to speak about research a lot because I am a researcher in nature. If you look at the problems that SMEs are actually, experiencing, what you find the incubation programs trying to do is respond at a very high level. So, where an issue is flagged around access to finance, nobody really probes around what the issue with regards to access to finance is, which means just simply giving SMEs access to finance does not necessarily translate into them being able to manage their finances.
Sure.
Now, if you look at how these incubation programs are actually run, in terms of the financial literacy provided, it's at a very high level. And I would go as far as saying it's very cosmetic
Sure.
because we are dealing here, and when we talk about the construction as well as the steel industry, these are very nuanced industries that have got, a different way of working as opposed to any other industry. Therefore, when it comes to financial astuteness and commercial astuteness, there needs to be an actual how do I put this? An actual way of teaching them by doing as opposed to just telling. So what we've got in our incubation programs is you attend a number of training courses. However, whether you understood or not is not really measured.
Yeah.
We've got a lot of these incubation programs. A lot of them have got different how do I put this? Different outcomes in terms of how they measure success of the program. And it's really related to whether these SMEs who go into those programs actually come out as resilient SMEs who are going to grow and be able to sustain a business.
Yeah.
It's more on the front of we have graduated so many SMEs,
Yeah.
but what happens to those SMEs 2 or 3 years after the program is not monitored at all, which I would like to actually flag as an issue because I've actually done a study of a program we've got in our country where I've went and interviewed the ones who were still around, by the way, SMEs who had graduated from a said program to ask them, was the program actually valuable for you? And what came out was, no, it wasn't. I was in a program, I was given opportunities without being taught how to seek out opportunities.
Yeah.
I was given funding without being taught how to manage finances when I get
Yeah.
them and how to also seek out funding once I am outside of the program.
Yes.
And the issue of these incubation programs as well is that when you're graduating a lot of these companies outside of incubation programs and them having to fail means that as an industry, we are losing actual knowledge in terms of SMEs who have maybe learned something, but normally the resilience of an organization is attributable to their growth journey. So where you've
Mm.
got a company going out of business before, you know, it actually materializes into something, as an industry, we are losing capable, SMEs, because capability would come from the experience. And with the ridiculous number of failures we are seeing, especially at the early years, it means all our SMEs will always be at the, minimum level of maturity as an organization. And until we actually speak to those issues that are also directed at not only the macro issues that we're seeing, because a big part of resilience as well is based on the macro practices and activities that are done by these organizations on a day-to-day basis. So the other issue with these programs is they are structured at a very macro level. So you're looking at this access to finance issue. Yes, we have to speak to the macroeconomics of a context. However, let us not forget the micro part, because that's actually what sustains the business. Micro activities that are actually done right and sustained over time would be what ends up makes an entity end up being very, very successful. With that being said, I'm not saying all of them fail, but currently I feel like that's where our features of our current incubation programs are lacking.
Yeah, thank you so much for that very interesting input, Zama. It makes me think my two nephews, they are still in primary. Well, the one is just now in secondary, but sometimes they have these entrepreneurship days, and it's basically one day, and they must take stuff to school, and then they must sell it, and then it's over. And then at one point, I actually told them, I think the challenge in entrepreneurship is to continue with it, and it is not just making a once-off. The value of success in terms of entrepreneurship is to do it over and over again and to become sustainable in doing that. So I can truly identify with what you say. Florence, just a question on from the competition side. You are dealing with so many competition authorities in Africa, especially Western Africa. Have you come across certain SME remedies or policies? And do they, are the different authorities adopting fairly similar approaches? What are your views, just based on what you have seen, just from a features perspective?
Thanks again, and I'm sure you've heard it. I would also like to, besides thanking Odie for this opportunity, I'd also like to thank the Betweenity team for putting this up. It's truly a privilege to be here. And every time I get the opportunity to share my perspective on how it works in the competitive space, it's truly an honor. And I've heard the conversation with my co-panelists here today. I must commend all the work that's put into encouraging SME across the continent. But taking it from a regulatory point of view, I have to say that competition authorities are tasked a bit differently from sector-specific regulators when it comes to promoting fair competition or preventing anti-competitive conduct. And our role in protecting not just the market to ensure that it's competitive, but it's really act with respect to consumer welfare. In essence, as a competition authority, our key objective is really to protect the competitive process. If you know what I mean. And part of how we do this is support economic efficiency. And you would see it in whether it's in our ex ante regulatory process or our ex post investigative process. So we do have a responsibility to balance it, create this level playing field. And I see it with several competition authorities. And Odie had mentioned in South Africa, for example, and even in Nigeria, we also have, with respect to our regulations, how we protect smaller businesses, what our considerations are when we make a decision or a determination when it comes to mergers, for instance. So our role is to make sure that there's a level playing field that works for all, whether you're a business or you're a consumer. And with respect to the lessons learned, the lesson with respect to remedies from my end is, first of all, understanding the role that SMEs play in the development of the economy and the effect of their presence or otherwise in the economy. Now, with that understanding, as a competition authority, you want to make sure that the remedies that are available somewhat encourage some kind of exemptions for SMEs on grounds that, this is an SME that is seeking to thrive, that you're making sure that there are no barriers to entry or expansion if they already exist in the market, and where there are anti-competitive conducts, that there's some kind of exemptions to fines or to sanctions. And I'll give a very good examples. There are other tools that can be used to protect the SME and encourage their sustainability. So you don't always have to fine. You can issue warnings. You can issue advisories, and these may suffice. And I'll give a very good example with what we did in Nigeria in the aviation sector.
Yeah.
And particularly with respect to ground handling. We had seen that the targets of investigation had come together in an association setting and agreed among themselves to fix the price of their services. When that case came to us, we started to look at the impact that these multiple small businesses could have in the bigger picture with respect to the entire aviation sector. There's no way that a flight, whether domestic or international, will come into this country and not require the services of these ground handlers.
Yeah.
From the moment our suitcases get in the plane to when they're given to us, you need these people. And so we had to look at the impacts on the entire aviation sector if we were to say impose hefty penalties on these ground handlers. And we decided against that. We decided, instead of a penalty, to give them a compliance training. And so we got a compliance expert to come and teach them things about competition. Because in the course of the investigation, we realized that, there's a depth of understanding on how competition regulation operates. And to them, it was, things are difficult in the economy and we have to find a way to help ourselves. And so we came together, and then they lost the independent mind.
Yeah.
And so, as a regulator who understands that we need these people, this is the impact on the industry and the efficiency they bring into that sector, we decided, instead of a penalty, we should issue a warning, considering they were also a first-time offender.
Yeah.
We also decided that, we should put them through a mandatory compliance training.
Yeah.
So I guess in essence, what I'm trying to say is, as a competition regulator, we're not trying to protect one business over the other, whether you're a small, medium enterprise. What we're trying to do is make sure that the competitive process is protected.
Yeah.
And encouraged. And while we welcome and we want the SMEs to remain as a solid constraint against the bigger businesses, we have to make sure that we're not making regulations for one person or for one business over and above others, because there's a need to really balance the expectations.
Yes, thank you very much, Florence, for that input. Zama, which gaps have you identified together with business rescuers that have come in to rescue some of the SMEs?
Yeah, thank you. A lot of these I've already mentioned a bit around, a lot of business rescuers. And this, funny enough, is not only related to SMEs, but if you look at the organizations within our industry, there is a bit of lack of financial control mechanisms where in our industry, the construction industry in particular, forecasting costs becomes very important for an organization. I mean, when you bid, for something or a project, you are bidding at a time where there are so many uncertainties. You don't know what the final cost of this would be. And if you look at our procurement processes, they're so long that by the time your project actually starts, where you have been awarded a contract based on, a price you had bid on earlier on, and it's now time for you to actually do the work, you find that inflation has really distorted, what you had planned on spending on the project. And yes, there are contractual mechanisms that could be put in place to offset that, but sometimes those mechanisms are just not enough. I mean, if you look at the steel price fluctuation from 2020 to 22, it was at a ridiculous amount, and it was not something anybody could have foreseen. The issues around blocking of certain transportation channels because of the UK Russia invasion could not have been foreseen by anybody. Now, that is a problem on its own, but where you've got contractors who actually don't even do that planning from the onset, despite there being so many uncertainties, they would often always find themselves in trouble. And what business rescuers are seeing is that the main issue is the management of finances. Sometimes it's not necessarily the fact that you don't have the money or you're not paid the money by your clients. It's just that maybe you didn't anticipate the payment cycles of the contract, and you find yourself in a position where you cannot pay your creditors. Next thing you know, you're being put into liquidation because of the waiting time. You owe so many people now. You've taken so many loans to try and keep afloat. Now your project is unprofitable. So there's a lack of financial control mechanisms, and this can get even worse for our SMEs who may not even be using different personal and business accounts because they have not been taught the value of actually doing that. So the confusion between that as well lends them into hot water. Also got, especially when it comes to the smaller SMEs, and as I was preparing for this panel discussion, I was actually trying to think of a solution around this, is also the over-reliance on single client types or a single client. Now, the bigger organizations may be able to cushion, the volatility of the sector that we operate in. But for the smaller guys, diversification is not necessarily a thing that they are taught because, and I understand why that would be the case, because you can't tell somebody to diversify when they have not, learned the basics in their actual core skill. But the reliance on one specific type of client can be dangerous, because if you're an SME and your only income is coming from public organizations, and in South Africa, we now know that normally public organizations do take a bit longer to pay. So if you've got other clients who are in the private space, what you could be doing is when you are cash flow negative, those other contracts can be there to be the cushion, until you get your payment from the bigger organizations. So the focus as well on just one client type and one client segment can actually become a problem for a smaller contractor. And where you've got contractors or SMEs all flocking to the same part of the industry, that can be a problem as well. I've noticed that I don't know whether it's a knowledge issue where they don't know of where other potential opportunities are. A lot of our SMEs in our industries are concentrated in the public sector space. Whereas if you are a paver or a civil contractor, there are mining capex projects that actually do have a need for those types of SMEs. But when everybody's concentrated here, competition will always be an issue, and you may always be missing the opportunity, as opposed to actually looking for maybe niche areas with fewer players, where then, you getting an opportunity becomes a bit easier. Another gap that was, identified by business rescue practitioners is the weak contract as well as project management capabilities. So if you work in our space, you have to be astute with understanding the contract. You have to be commercially astute. And in as much as sometimes I'm going to go back to business incubating programs, in as much as they train you on how to respond to a bid, they don't go into the details around contractual risk and what would happen if something happens in a contract. So if the contractors themselves, the small SMEs themselves, don't understand the risks involved, they cannot price for them. And they find themselves in situations where you've signed a contract, you did not understand fully what your battery limits are in terms of the contract, and now your client is telling you that, but this was included in your price. You are now in a position where, unfortunately, you're going to go out of business because you cannot finance this outside of what you had priced for, but you've already committed yourself through the contract in terms of what you would provide for that price. So that can actually also be a gap where we're continuously seeing contracting organizations going out of business because of those three things. And I have to mention this, it's not just the small guys. Sometimes the bigger guys are still actually also, falling into the trap of these three things around lack of financial control, your over-reliance on single clients, and then also your weak contractual and project management capabilities.
Thank you very much, Zama. That's very interesting. And it comes back to what you've said regarding the inadequacy of very high-level training and the importance of actually taking people under your wing and to try to teach them these things, all of these important things in detail and not just provide high-level training. Or what we often see in SME remedies in South Africa is just the obligation to put money into a fund, and then that fund must then subsidize training, but there's not specific characteristics that is or key success factors that are being linked to that particular training. It can be very high level, and then it's basically wasting money. If I think of the BCom that I did, for example, a couple of years ago, well, many years ago, that didn't prepare me for Betweenity, for example, not at all. Sometimes I'm too ashamed to say I have a BCom. So I can fully understand what you say there. Gregory, in which ways have you found that SME policies do not work?
Well, the problem is that in South Africa, generally, there is lack of enforcement of policies and laws. Generally. So we have a problem of laws just being ignored, policies just gathering dust, and so that's the overarching significant problem that we have in the country. Now, there's a couple of sub issues there that we need to look at. The first is that there's lack of consequence management, right? So if people don't implement policies, especially those that are geared at empowering SMEs, we have not seen anybody facing any, consequence management, whether people being taken through a disciplinary process or people being fired for not doing their work. We have not seen that. And as a consequence, people just simply don't do it. They know that there will not be any consequences.
Yeah.
Now, if you look at the other area as well, which contributes significantly towards the policy is not working, and I mentioned this earlier, that even when we set ourselves targets, well, nobody puts in sufficient effort and energy in making sure that those targets are met. We simply set new targets in the next financial year.
Yeah.
And it just keeps on rolling. And so that contributes significantly towards the policies not being effectively implemented. Both in the public and the private sector, by the way, we do have these wonderful policies around, for instance, paying our SMEs within 14 days, as an example. But we don't see that.
Exactly.
I think Zama has spoken to this effect already, that especially in the private sector, you'll find that people, are paid very, very late. And at the time when they receive the payment, their businesses are already weakened. Sadly, we are seeing the same tendencies emerging in the private sector as well. And so all of this manifests itself in the lack of sustainability of SMEs. And I think Zama spoke to this issue very strongly, that we build capacity within SMEs and we destroy it overnight by simply not ensuring that these companies are paid on time and that they are given sufficient support for them to grow. So as a consequence, we really don't have good examples across various sectors where we can say we can plot this company from the time that it was established to the time that it has become a big player in the sector wherein they are playing because of the support that they were provided. And our incubators don't work as well, because once they exit the incubation programs, they often find themselves in hardships and they disappear from the landscape. So where we've seen that they work, policies work, is where there is commitment, strong will from senior management, where people are held to accountable to their performance, and where targets have not been met, where SMEs have not been given priority support and early payment cycles and so on, where management really takes a very strong stance. We find that in instances where management is committed to such programs, policies do work. But as I said in my initial statement to a question, the general lack of observance of laws and policies in this country is a problem.
Right, thank you very much, Gregory. And Ms. Betty, which mistakes have you seen that have been made by policymakers in all of the areas that you have worked?
Well, maybe I'll be the apologist for policymakers here because I have one. People don't wake up in the morning to go and make mistakes. When they go to work. I think the realization that mistakes have been made is often a factor of reflection on hindsight. And there are various circumstances that lead to this. One is that governments are big. They're big institutions, and very often it is very difficult to get a coordinated perspective and view on one thing. The Department for Industry, for instance, may be very keen on promotion of local manufacturing. But the Treasury and the macro managers may lack the tools, and therefore you're unable to create the environment of affordable money. And so in the context of high interest rates, you will not have the industrial landscape that is desired by the country. Sometimes many countries might not have sufficient energy supplied, and therefore they are not able to onboard as many manufacturing firms as they would. And the market still requires goods, and somehow with very liberal and open policies, these are available from outside the country. And once cheap imports are coming, it also depresses the market for local manufacturing. So it's a very complex situation. And I think the point I'm trying to make is that it isn't always deliberate to make these mistakes. But the other thing that we also need to appreciate is that governments, policymakers, in this case I'm talking about governments, obviously operate in a certain political context and with very different constituents, and sometimes the manifestation of policy failure is really a manifestation of the contestation of various contests between various constituencies. A constituency, you gave the example of steel. a constituency that wants to promote local businesses and smaller businesses may come into conflict with a constituency that wants to also see the growth of our larger multinationals. I'm not saying that is what has happened, but sometimes it's very difficult to achieve the same results for these different constituencies, and they are powerful and they are legitimate. So what manifests itself as policy failure is really a manifestation of this contestation. But having said that, some failures really arise out of failure to consult sufficiently with the constituencies and with different stakeholders. It's very easy for policymakers to sit in their offices and to believe that they know what needs to be done. But as Zama was saying, if you start to send money, I mean, if we decide that what is really required is money and don't spend sufficient attention on working with entrepreneurs beyond the training on money and seeing how they really manage it, the result when a program is evaluated 3 years later down the road is that was a total waste. So it's important for policymakers to get a very long-term view and not an ad hoc and episodic intervention. Because somebody, I mean, there's a saying that says, to a child with a hammer, every problem is a nail. So to somebody in finance, every problem is finance. No, it isn't. There is a variety of issues that SMEs are facing, and we need a holistic approach. Otherwise, these sectored and siloed initiatives will lead to a conclusion that everything failed.
Yes, thank you, Ms. Betty. And Florence, in the short life of the FCCPC and even shorter of the ECOWAS Regional Competition Authority, have there been any lessons learned? Have there been any instances where certain decisions were made that eventually turned out to be maybe suboptimal and which you took back to the drawing board and which you tried to think, right, in future we will handle it differently?
I mean, to the best of my knowledge, I can't say so. I mean, from the Nigerian perspective, no. Now, with respect to how, we're thinking through, what I would say is the flexibility of the regulator is very important. The discretionary powers of the regulator is very important in any market. Now, there are risks in every market, and the risk could be capital, the risk could be industrial policies itself. And so the creativity of the regulator is very important. And you must take advantage of all the multiple tools that you have. Look back at the markets after certain decisions have been made and analyze for itself determination reached is effective. From a competition perspective, for instance, I would be how the market benefits. If you're in small businesses to be able to get into the space, do they have access to an essential commodity or facility? You want to ensure that that whatever determination that was made, there were limits. You have created a situation where there are limited or zero barriers to entry and expansion. For instance, if we talk about access to credit, it's very difficult for a competition authority to guarantee certain outcomes or access to credit. What I will be saying is, have you ensured that there's a more organized system by SMEs, either through forming a structured association that strengthens them to approach governments for this kinds of access to credit? And of course, at the end of the day, the ultimate question is whether the remedy preferred by a competition authority has encouraged some kind of efficiency or inefficiency. In essence, you must take a step back, look at the markets that you have made a determination over after a period of time, and look inwards and tell yourself, or ask yourself, have we encouraged efficiency in this? Have we encouraged inefficiency where the businesses have access to an essential facility, but don't know what to do with that access? And I think that, is really taken from what Zama said. It is possible to, have made decisions and determinations in favor of smaller businesses, but if they don't know how to work with the access that you've given to them or that you have encouraged, then there's going to be another problem of inefficiency and potential exits from that market, because again, they don't know how to manage the funds that they've received. Their managerial skills and capacity generally is not there. And so, yes, whilst there are no live examples that I have either from the ECOWAS Competition Authority experience or even from the FCCPC experience, again, we're barely 5 years old. We've not made that many determinations. And even the Argan case that I just mentioned earlier, it's limited to the aviation space. And so far, I can sit back and say, you know what? What's important is that they know what the regulatory policies are. There's certainty in that space, and there's now an open door for interaction between the businesses and the regulator. And so that's the way that's the best I can respond right now. But I guess in another few years, we'll be able to look back at our cases and do an impact assessment.
Thank you very much, Florence. I must say, Ms. Betty, what struck me about what you mentioned in the beginning was the whole issue of the clustering of SMEs. And that has the benefit of ensuring that when there are positive externalities, that the different SMEs can benefit from that. Can you just tell us something more about how that works, the clusters? Because I think that is a gem that you mentioned there, and I just quickly want to explore that.
I mean, many industries will grow. I mean, no one company or no one business can supply everything. So in the context, say, of a country that is trying to grow a sector, say leather sector, provision of dedicated industrial space enables various businesses that produce different components to obviously promote specialization. So a company that produces salts can be co-located with a company that produces clasps and produces heels. So that and all co-located with a final assembler. So that enables many. First of all, it enables many businesses. I mean, the final product manufacturer to specialize in just assembling. I think in South Africa, you've done that with the motor vehicles sector and the different small businesses that support the sector, some producing seats, some producing wire harnesses, some producing wheels, tires. So that's what I mean by getting industrial clusters. And once a country has made a decision around which sectors it chooses to promote, then it pays attention to also creating the space for the components and the different facets of this industry industry to grow. That's what I mean by clustering. And many, I mean, we have examples of that, and I mean, literature is full of that. You know, the Italian, you know, leather clusters, and in your case in South Africa, your motor vehicle clusters. But it's a deliberate policy that links up all the different facets between, you know, the public policy that promotes it, the provision of space, the creation of markets through policy, whether it is through external market access or local market creation, the development of financial instruments to support the sector. So it's a holistic package, as we talked about earlier.
Yes. Thank you, Ms. Betty. Gregory, if we look forward, what would be some of the practical things that you would recommend in order for us to make sure that SME policies are effective, except for, let's say, for example, requiring better implementation of policies? I know that's a very big temptation to go that route, but just based on your experience at the Black Business Council, what are the dilemmas, the practical issues that they face, which you believe are low-hanging fruit?
I think, you know, it's about, you know, looking at specific opportunities where we can be able to make meaningful impact, looking at you know, various sectors. I think you know, Zama makes a very, you know, paints a very big picture, for instance, of the construction industry. I mean, if I have to use an example of one of our big state-owned enterprises here called Sunrise, which is in charge of our national roads, they're about to roll out the 100 billion infrastructure program over the next couple of years. And if in those kind of instances we can have, you know, contracted development programs that are where we're able then to bring in SMEs, to subcontract them, give them access to finance, and then give them the support so that they can then be able to go and run their sustainable businesses. I think, you know, we should then look at those kind of opportunities and try to maximize the benefits that come out of this. Yes, the macro picture is important to us as Competition Council, but I think the most effective implementation will happen at a micro level, at an entity level, at a project level. That's where the most impact is going to be. As much as overall we can have all these you know, policies that we have, we've got to look at you know, at opportunities at a micro level to effectively implement this.
Thank you, Gregory. And Zama, from your perspective, anything in relation to how to improve the situation, whether it's through the incubation programs or any other thing that you think is really necessary to move the needle on SME policies?
I hear you, Odie, and thank you for that question. And I think for me, this is a topic I'm very passionate about, because the issue of resilience of construction firms in our industry is a topic that's, you know, much at heart for me. We've got so much unemployment in the country, where you know, a lot of these SMEs are actually driver of the uptake of the people who are unemployed. So with regards to that, maybe let me base it from an incubator, you know, point of view, what they can improve. For me, it's very important for a company that's going to be resilient to have a firm grasp on its strategy going forward. And not only that, but in terms of resilience, how it has been, you know, achieved, just from the study that I've been doing for my PhD by the large organizations, is not just focusing on I need this, but why you need that particular thing in order for you to grow. So I see the resilience of an entity as being in the form of three stages. And resilience for me is actually learning to bounce back from disruption, because one disruption that catches you off guard can mean, the end of that organization's life. And by then bouncing back from disruption, if you follow a three-stage approach of not only dealing with crises as they occur, but teaching these SMEs how to actually actively and preemptively scan the market, be able to anticipate certain disruption before it occurs, does give them the strength, because that equips you with enough information for you to then try and plan for what you would do if that's the case.
Yeah.
So first, give them, a good introduction in how they scan in the market, because yes, we do have disruptions in our organization, but a lot of them are things you can actually anticipate if you actually do the scanning. I mean, things like if there's going to be a strike, a steel worker strike, it's something that you normally anticipate around negotiation times, which are things that we know. So you can build that into your construction program so that when it happens, you can at least cushion the blow of that downtime.
Yeah.
So first anticipate, and then learn how do you then deal with disruptions as they arise? Not only scanning preemptively, but we do have an issue where SME organizations sometimes don't see an issue until it's very late. So the ability to have an organization that is very conscious of what is happening at every level, organizational, project-wise. Do they know when there's an issue? If there's an issue contractually, I'm not going to wait until the end, to speak to the client. I must have active monitoring systems in place within my organizations that will tell me that there's a problem here. So things like looking at your cash flows, what did you expect you were going to receive? What did you expect you were going to spend? If you've seen, I've already spent more than I anticipated mid-project, you can try and, institute certain mitigation strategies during the project. You can decide, okay, I'll go to my suppliers and maybe bulk buy to benefit from, supplier discounts, and then can actually save the project budget. But over and above that, there's also the learning part of it, which I feel is very important. How do you learn from these disruptions? A lot of our small and micro enterprises repeats the same mistakes over and over and over again. And the reason is that once there's learning that has occurred, yes, we've burnt our fingers here. There's no structured way of sitting and documenting and communicating lessons learned in terms of how to avoid it in the future. And if you don't do that at an organizational level, but also whilst having a repository somewhere where that knowledge is stored, because historically our industry is very transient in terms of project teams and people come in and leave your organization, it means that knowledge would then leave with those people without having something to equip you going forward to actually realign your strategies to, if this was what we were doing, we got burnt here, let's maybe pivot and do this, as an alternative. So there's that learning that's happening. One thing that I've seen actually also help these smaller organizations is partnering them with bigger organizations. Now, in practice, it's very hard to do because even if you have that, there's a 30% rule in terms of our procurement now that if a contractor gets work, 30% would have to go to, SMEs in those particular locations, right? But the issue with that is just simply saying you're going to take somebody and give them 30% of your contract value does not necessarily mean you are actually empowering those people to be able to do the job. So it's very important the partnering and mentoring of the smaller organizations by a bigger organization. And I don't know how this would be done, but if that was actually ingrained into the legislation, put into contracts that you're not just going to appoint, but you must actually actively mentor these companies. And there's a success story where I've seen this happen. And I remember my co-panelist Gregory mentioned that we actually don't have, a success story one can cite. And one of the organizations I've actually looked at in my PhD is one such success story. 10 years ago, they were a very small company, still trying to deal with all these issues facing the SMEs in the country. But because of there was an issue, I don't know if you recall, where we had the World Cup and the colluding firms that were, found guilty of that collusion, then were then meant to take smaller organizations and mentor them. So from that relationship, because learning by doing is a thing, when you're partnered up with somebody who's bigger, who's seen some of these issues and understanding the approach as to why they do certain things, mean you learn to do it on your own when those things happen, because you may not necessarily be, privy to disruptions that would happen post the incubation program. But when you've been partnered up with a person who's already facing those disruptions, you then know that when it's your turn or when you are bigger, this is actually how I'm going to handle it. And as we speak, that particular construction firm is one of the biggest construction firms we've got in the country. And in terms of trying to find out how they managed to grow, especially when the construction industry wasn't doing so well, what made them more resilient? And some of it is their partnerships and access to the knowledge they needed whilst still at infancy stage, actually ended up assisting them in growing to be bigger. So I would think that's also one thing that could be put into these programs. A lot of the other things I've already mentioned when I cited things like financial contractual literacy, those would also help. But actual mentorship and learning by doing, I believe, is something that holds potential, a solution for the current SME program we've got. Admittedly, I do admit we don't have enough big players to mentor so many smaller players, but the more smaller players we grow, the more big players we will have. Because another issue we've got in our country currently is market concentration, where about 80% of the projects are rolled out, are awarded to bigger companies, which means the SMEs who are, much more in quantity are fighting for a really smaller piece of the pie. And it really, really becomes very hard for any of them to survive in that particular.
Thank you very much, Sama. That's been very powerful. Just a last question, Florence, to you, and then I'm so sorry, but then we unfortunately wouldn't have time for a last round of comments. We are running a little bit out of time. But Florence, something that I noted, and I think it's about 3-4 years ago, the Namibia Competition Commission said that they are going to prioritize SMEs in the following way. They are going to make sure that whenever an SME comes with a complaint against a large firm, they are going to fast track that complaint because they are mindful that SMEs do not have a lot of resources. And by the time that a normal investigation period has lapsed, that small business could be long gone. And I was thinking about that now as Zama was speaking. Is that perhaps something that the FCCPC may consider? Not necessarily that, but also trying to accommodate SMEs whenever they come to the Commission, to try to put them through a kind of a fast track process.
Indeed. One of the, like I had said before, the Federal Competition and Consumer Protection Act prioritizes small businesses in our decision-making process and just in our general regulatory approach. And so that's important. But what I would say is, whilst that's at the FCCPC right now, you can file your petitions or your complaints and they're getting addressed as they come. Immediately you're assigned case handlers. And again, I can't, and it's different from the Namibia in the sense that there are different things that inherently determine the risk profiles of various sectors. For instance, there are industry-specific policies, legal hurdles, capital issues, or even just a general lack of awareness that increases the risk profile in various sectors. And so for me to say that it would be a one size fits all type approach where any SME that makes a complaint to the FCCPC would get immediate attention, that may not be the case, because for the regulator, we might be interested in, first of all, understanding the industry policies, understanding the effect of certain conducts in the market. And so that could take long in making certain determinations. So for me, policy interventions should be tailored more to reflect sector-specific dynamics and risk. Avoiding generic remedy is something that I would love to do. I would want to understand the market. I would not want to have a uniform approach across all markets. For instance, the telecommunication sector is very capital intensive. It affects so many consumers. It could raise national security issues. So, of course, giving it priority would be important to me. Yeah, I will suggest as regulators that we're very flexible in our approach and the remedies that we take. We understand the specific market. We use our role as protectors of the economy to advise government where we need to. We seek ways and means to meet our ultimate objective of protecting the market, as well as make significant inputs as to how developments of the SMEs can come to be. Again, the approach is really understand your tools, understand the various ways that you can impute into all the multiple sectors, whether it's in the form of advocacy or it's, giving priority to petitions that come in from smaller businesses, or it's even just in the advisories that we give to government and sector-specific regulators as to how they handle SMEs. So to the question, it is definitely something that's in the FCCPA, which is to prioritize SMEs, make sure that the market is competitive. But like I said, as a regulator in any market, as an anti-competitive regulator in any market, our role is not to guarantee the expectations, but to make sure that the general competitive process is protected.
Right. Oh, thank you very much for that input, Florence. It's really much appreciated. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you to all our panelists. It was a fantastic discussion, and I really appreciate your great input. And I think the discussion is not over. I think we must stay in touch to see how we can best ensure that SMEs are emboldened in a way that helps them and in a way that helps the supply chain. Because we can't promote the one at the cost of the other in neither of those directions. Thank you very much, Zama, Florence, Miss Betty, and Gregory. It's been a great pleasure to have you on our side, and thank you so much for that.